Hi, I'm Mary Wright, and I am Associate Provost for Teaching and Learning. And I also direct the Sheridan Center for Teaching and Learning at Brown University. The Sheridan Center is an integrated center for teaching and learning, and so we bring together digital learning and design, educational development, and direct academic support for students.
And I'm Emma Jane Rodenheiser. I'm currently a senior at Brown University studying neuroscience, and I've been helping Mary with some of her research.
So today we're going to focus on how did Center for Teaching and Learning programs shift during the pandemic? And the impact of the pandemic has certainly been consequential for the work of Centers for Teaching and Learning, affecting dimensions ranging from institutional positioning to workload. So even prior to the pandemic, centers were experiencing significant changes in roles. Bruce Kelly and others, in their 2017 study, found greater indications of cross-functional integration, most frequently in instructional technology, but also in assessment and online education. And in their 2020 book, also published pre-pandemic, Josh Kim and Eddie Maloney write about this trend as well. So on top of these existing shifts, many centers experienced and continue to experience changes in their roles, their workload, and organizational positioning. And thus far, there are two very good special issues published in To Improve the Academy and the Journal on Centers for Teaching and Learning that focused on the subjective experiences of center staff or individual case studies about programmatic transitions in one center. But the study that Emma, Jane, and I present today takes a different lens, an empirical and systematic overview of the landscape of US centers and their programs. And so again, our key research question is, how did US Center for Teaching and Learning programs shift during the COVID-19 pandemic? And this research question is situated in a larger book project I'm working on about Centers for Teaching and Learning. It began when I was past president of the POD network, and POD is the US Professional Association for Educational Development. And we were often asked by the media or scholars, how many centers for teaching and learning are there? And didn't really have a good response. And so at a certain point, I finally wanted to find out a good answer to the question. And so in December 2019, I did a comprehensive web search with the search terms and methodology linked in this document. And in many ways, it was kind of a guess the number of jelly beans in this jar project. So by December 2020, I had looked at all of the sites and found a few more, finding 1,206 centers in all, which represents slightly over a fifth or 21% of all US colleges and universities. And in addition to this, I found 15 system-wide educational networks, such as CERTL, the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning, or the Great Lakes College Association, that network educational development functions. And by factoring those in, there's 27% coverage. So with this list, I thought there was a treasure trove of information and that it would be good to use the database for a book project. And so for each website, I captured all of the variables that you see here. But for the purpose of the presentation today, Emma Jane and I are going to focus on just two. So first, we're looking at workshop topics, which were copied from websites, and also whether or not a center had digital learning staff, such as instructional designers or educational technologists. And I'll note that I was in the middle of this project when the pandemic hit. So I had looked at a pretty random half of US centers to code them before the pandemic, and about half afterwards. So this is a cross-sectional analysis, and we recognize that a longitudinal study would be better. But we still think that it gives us a glimpse into some interesting shifts into these important organizational units during the pandemic. So in all, I listed over 4,500 program titles if they were locally offered. And so in other words, I didn't capture proprietary educational development offerings like programs offered by ACUE. Many centers also offered other program types, of course, like course design institutes or faculty learning communities. But here we are focusing on shorter term programs like workshops and roundtables. So Emma Jane then did the yeoman's work of coding these by focus. And so for each center, we coded these on a 1-0 binary. So in other words, if the Sheridan Center did 8 workshops on active learning, these were coded as just one or that topic being present. And then Emma Jane also normalized by number of centers. So I turn things over to her to talk more about our findings.
Yeah, so here we can see all of the different focus categories. So the distinct program titles for each institution were categorized into one of these 28 main focus categories. And focuses ranged from general teaching and learning and assessment strategies to more nuanced topics such as trauma-informed teaching and information literacy. And as Mary mentioned, we gave each workshop category a Boolean variable for each institution, and then looked at how these focuses shifted after COVID started. So this graph shows the difference between pre and post-pandemic of the average and normalized number of offerings in each focus category. So bars extending to the left represent a decrease in focus offerings since the pandemic hit, while bars extending to the right represent an increase. So most noticeably, there was an overall increase in most workshop topics post-pandemic. And now we can zoom in on the largest decreases and increases in focus category. So here we saw the largest decreases in writing and communication, organizational development and policy, general community building, career development, and teaching improvement. Focus increases were most notable in engagement and active learning, diversity, equity, and inclusion, course and curriculum design, assessment, grading, and feedback, and online remote transition. What is surprising in these major trends is that digital learning was not the biggest increase. But when we contextualize the increases, they do make sense. Instructors had to be more intentional to engage students online. When students are no longer all living in the same campus environment, the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion become much more apparent. Course and curriculum design were forced to shift when students and professors were limited to an online structure. Normal strategies for assessment, grading, and feedback had to be assessed themselves and altered to fit online learning. And of course, the online transition was a huge adjustment for many course styles. Next, we also looked at the variation in workshop focus based by institutional type. So as you can see in this table, although there were nuances by institutional type, the overall pattern of an increase in focus offerings did hold.
So here we looked at centers that had digital learning staff and compared them to those that did not. So focusing on workshops that looked at the online remote hybrid instruction, we did see that twice as many integrated centers on average offered workshops about this topic, comparing pre and post-pandemic rates, while centers without IT staff saw a decrease. Yet interestingly, the presence of IT staff seemed to enable a center to more resiliently scale up non-tech offerings as well. So to sum up, if you worked at a center for teaching and learning and felt busy, that's because you were. At least as measured by only one program type, workshops, there was a mean increase in offerings comparing centers coded pre and post-pandemic. And interestingly, overall and across institutional types, the topics that saw the greatest increase were not technology or online focused workshops, but really those that in some ways are the bread and butter of Center for Teaching and Learning offerings. And I think this strategy was very helpful in facilitating some of the reported gains that we are hearing from faculty, that the pandemic and their work with the center really helped them fundamentally think about their courses pedagogically from the ground up. And of course, it is reflective that the pandemic was not the only challenge that centers were facing. Add on top of that, the election and calls for racial equity and accountability. So finally, Josh Kim and Eddie Maloney write in their 2020 book about learning innovation that the future work of learning professionals will be centered around institutional resiliency. So it's interesting to see that in some ways, centers that integrated traditional educational development and digital learning functions seem to be the most resilient, at least as suggested by their capacity to expand their programming in number of topics. So thank you, and we look forward to your questions.